Entitled this sermon, The Priests Who Bought Him. In the New Testament, you'll sometimes find the Pharisees and the Sadducees sort of lumped together. But actually, they were usually at loggerheads. They weren't really on speaking terms at all, but we do find them in the gospel account sometimes joining forces in their opposition to Jesus. Now, just as last week, we saw that the Pharisees are not mentioned at all in the Old Testament, and we wonder, well, where did they come from in this period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament? So, similar question we can ask of the Sadducees. Where did they come from? What did they stand for? What were they about? Certainly, in the New Testament, the Pharisees figure far more prominently. I quickly counted up in my concordance the number of references to Pharisees in the Gospels and in the rest of the New Testament, and it came to 95, but it was much easier to count the number of Sadducee references. It was only 14. But nevertheless, in the lead up to Jesus' death and resurrection, the Sadducees are playing their part in the story. So, I'm going to explain something of where they came from, what they stood for, and how they differed in certain vital respects from what the Pharisees taught. So, a bit of Old Testament history. You may know that the Jewish people, first of all, the northern kingdom of Israel, and a century or so later, the southern kingdom of Judah, because of their unfaithfulness to Yahweh, their God, God had pronounced that they would go into exile. And that's the period then of the exile in Babylon. Then we have the story of Nehemiah and Ezra. Daniel's in the mix there as well, and the return of the people to the land. But in returning to the land, there was no return of a king in the line of David. They were not allowed a king. So there was if you like, a leadership vacuum of these people who'd returned from exile, who are now living back in Jerusalem and in Judah. And that vacuum of leadership was filled by the likes of Ezra and Nehemiah, both of whom were priests. They rallied a broken, discouraged people. They put courage into them to rebuild the temple. They enabled them and empowered them to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They were back in the land, but they had no king. So the priests, in the leadership of the people, began to play more and more an important role in leading them. Now, you had to be born a priest. You couldn't just, apply to the equivalent of Bristol Baptist College or Spurgeon's College and say, I'd like to become a priest, please. No, you had to be of the tribe of Levi. And you had to be in a particular section of the tribe of Levi. It was hereditary. And this period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament was turbulent in terms of history. It's the days of the Greek Empire, and then the move from the Greek Empire to the Roman Empire. And as usual, Palestine was right in the mix of that, being caught between these superpowers. And there were various dynasties that arose, but I won't bore you with all those details. Suffice to say, it was a turbulent period. And in that period, certain priestly families began to rise to the top of the leadership of the people. And so there arose in that period a new category of priests, which you won't find in the Old Testament, but which keep popping up in the New Testament. And these were the chief priests. As I say, that's not an Old Testament category. You won't find any reference to chief priests in the Old Testament. You find a reference to the high priest, but there was only one of those at any one time, whereas there were quite a number of chief priests in the New Testament period, from whom the one high priest would be selected from time to time. Now, our first citing, or the first reference to chief priests, is a part of a story that we all read every Christmas. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 4 says this: when he, referring to King Herod, had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. Chief priests were part of this Sadducees grouping. They were exclusive. They were small in number. There were far more. There were thousands of Pharisees, but the number of Sadducees was very small. They were the aristocrats of the time, and they lived in the best postcode areas of Jerusalem. You know, they would have been, you know, on the housing programs that you've seen today, these wonderful whatever houses that they had. They were educated, they were wealthy, and they were also rather unpopular with ordinary people, from whom the Sadducees were very aloof. But they were influential. They held the majority vote on the Jewish ruling council, which was known as the Sanhedrin. And so, therefore, if they chose to do so, they could outvote the Pharisees. But the Pharisees were very popular with the people, so sometimes the Sadducees let the Pharisees have their way so as not to cause a bit of a riot. And you see those tensions coming through in some of the sort of like aside references to what was happening in the run-up to the crucifixion of Jesus. Politically, they were very influential, and they collaborated with the Roman authorities in order to maintain their privileged position. And you see a reference to that here in John's Gospel. The chief priests and the Pharisees, this is where they're agreeing together, called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, John 11 and verse 47. This is after the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead. And they said, what are we accomplishing? Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up, oh, you know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. But it's that little phrase there. They were afraid that if things got out of hand, the Romans would come and they'd say to the Sadducees, you haven't kept things in order, you're out. Now, as I said, normally the Pharisees and the Sadducees had little to do with each other. There was no love lost between them. And they differed in their approach to politics. The Sadducees sort of cozying up to the Romans, the Pharisees seeing them as Gentile dogs and trying to keep as far away from being sullied by contact with the Romans kept up. But their beliefs were different as well. The Pharisees believed passionately in the scriptures and also in the oral tradition that they believed had also come down from Moses on a parallel track. So you had God's written word and you had God's word that had been memorized by people, and you needed to keep both together. It was on that issue that Jesus clashed with the Pharisees when Jesus said to them, you teach us doctrines of God merely the traditions of men. And he was referring to this oral tradition. The Sadducees wanted nothing to do with this oral tradition, and they said, no, it's only scripture, and especially the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the body. The Sadducees didn't. The Sadducees believed that once you die, that was it. It was oblivion. And there was no soul, there was no afterlife, and there was no resurrection of the body. And on that issue, they clashed with Jesus in the story about the woman who had 7 husbands and each died. And the Pharisees were having a laugh and saying, so at the resurrection, which husband is the correct one, etc., etc. And Jesus said to them, you neither know the scriptures nor the power of God. You've got it wrong there. They didn't believe in angels, whereas the Pharisees did. The Pharisees nudged the hope of the Messiah was to come, whereas the Sadducees had virtually abandoned hope in any sense of Messiah coming. And the Pharisees believed that God was sovereign over the affairs of the nations, and one day he would bring that Messiah in. The Sadducees, however, said, no, this is life as it is. You just got to make the best of it. It's all down to human choice and human free will. And so you may as well cozy up to the Romans because this is the only life that there is. It's almost atheistic in its approach, isn't it? But that's what has come down to us, not just through the scriptures, but from other sources from this period of what the Sadducees believed. So, how did they come into conflict with Jesus? Well, more so than the Pharisees, they saw Jesus as a political threat. They could see how popular he was with the people, And they could see the potential of upsetting the Romans, because the Romans were very twitchy when Jewish crowds gathered. On Palm Sunday, when those crowds welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, they approached Jesus and said, look at what's happening. They were thinking, crumbs, if Pilate gets to hear of this, and no doubt Roman soldiers are watching very closely what was happening, because anything to do with a messianic claim, the Romans knew that could mean trouble. They were saying, Jesus, shut them up. The Romans, they're watching. See them over there. Jesus was a threat politically, because if things got out of hand, they'd be the ones to be blamed by the Romans. And of course, Jesus didn't hold back from antagonizing them either. And this is where on the Palm Sunday story, we've got Jesus going into the temple and what we call the cleansing of the temple. And he did it quite violently. He wasn't polite about it. Let me read to you from Mark 11. On reaching Jerusalem, having come in on the donkey, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. Now, that's quite a scene that Jesus has provoked there, isn't it? This wasn't something done in a corner. This would have got the whole of Jerusalem talking. As he taught them, he said, it is written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you, thinking particularly of the Sadducees and the priests, you have made it a den of thieves, of robbers. Now then, the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. So let's get this story in context. First of all, this story doesn't say that it's wrong to buy and sell on sort of like a church premises. Jesus called them a den of thieves, not a den of traders, all right? But they were there in order to facilitate the worship of God. The temple area was a series of, first of all, outside courts, the court of the Gentiles, then the court of women, and eventually you got to the Holy of Holies, into which the high priest alone could go, and that only once a year. So you had these various grades, and those outer courts of the temple, and Herod, in building this temple, wanted to outdo the magnificence and splendor even of Solomon's temple. So this temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, it was huge. It was ornate. It was decorated in golden vines. It was an awesome sight and declared to be one of the ancient wonders of the world. But the outer courts were used as a bird market. You see, if you were going to the temple and you were going to offer a sacrifice, the only sacrifices that you could offer were of perfect specimens of animals. So you couldn't just, pick one up off the street, wander into the temple and say to the Mr. Priest, can I please offer this as a sacrifice? So this temple market was set up so that the animals on sale there had already been passed and certified as suitable for sacrifice. So you bought your dove, or whatever animal it was, and poor people could only buy small animals, and then you could go into the temple, give it to the priest, it would be sacrificed on your behalf. But you might have only got Roman coinage in your pockets. And you couldn't go into the temple area, the inner temple area, with anything that bore an image like the coin of Caesar on it. Roman coinage was not allowed in the temple. It was idolatrous. It had the image of a man on it. So, as well as the stalls selling the animals for sacrifice, there were stalls of exchange where you could exchange your Roman coins and be given a temple coin in exchange. And with that temple coin, you would then go and buy the animal. Now, that's the background to this story. So those tables of exchange and the selling of the animals were all there to enable the proper worship of God. So the fact that there was buying and selling going on there, not a problem, not an issue. But in certifying which animals were fit for sacrifice, sometimes the priests apparently turned a blind eye to animals that weren't perfect. And in the exchange of Roman coinage to temple coinage, they fixed the exchange rates, and a lot of it went into their own pockets. There was corruption. They were taking advantage of the people who were coming sincerely to worship God. And Jesus saw red. And rightly so. He said, I've had enough of this. You have made the temple of our God a den of thieves. And so, whoosh, went the tables, flying away the doves and the birds. Again, I take you back to the Christmas story, where in Luke chapter 2, we find that the parents of Jesus were doing what I've just described. When the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. So it was the sale of doves and pigeons that was going on, but it was the corruption that had grown up around it that maddened Jesus. And of course, then the Sadducees and the priests came to him and said, by what authority are you doing these things? You can imagine how livid they were with him for doing that. Who's he, a Galilean from Nazareth of all places, to do this in the temple of God? And Jesus could have given a very straight answer to that. Jesus thereby stirred up their animosity. And so when the scriptures say, they said, oh, we've got to get rid of him, we've got to kill him. It's all that on the road to Calvary. So what lessons can we learn from this? First of all, God uses evil human designs and schemes to a good end. And when I read that again this morning, I couldn't help but think of Ukraine. You see, let me take you back to that John 11 reference with Lazarus and the chief priests and the Sadducees being concerned that the people might believe in this Jesus who just raised somebody from the dead. What a ridiculous thing for them to do, they were thinking. One of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. And then John adds this comment. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. In other words, John is saying Caiaphas didn't know it. He wasn't aware of it, but he was speaking a prophetic word from God about the significance of the death of this one man, Jesus. Caiaphas was thinking, look, if the Romans are going to sort of keep calm and don't get mad at us, what's the death of this one man, Jesus of Nazareth? Doesn't matter. Just get on with it. Do it. But God had other ideas. God was able to do something of which we are now the beneficiaries in the salvation that we call our own. I couldn't help thinking as I was looking over my notes, as I said this morning, Lord, I don't get it. Why have you allowed this, that, and the other with Ukraine? You can imagine it, can't you? You probably had the same thoughts. And it comes back to saying, Lord, I don't get it. I don't understand it. If it was me in charge, it wouldn't have happened. But you are God, and I trust you to do something and to bring something out of this that is beyond my ken. And I also remember that Jesus had prophesied that in the end times there will be wars and rumors of wars. I think, no, we mustn't be surprised when the world acts like the world, when the God of this world does what the God of this world does. But we stand up to it, pray against it as we have done, and continue to do so. You see, whatever the evil schemes of men might be, this is an example of Caiaphas, the high priest who was a Sadducee, who thought that in getting rid of Jesus, it would be job done. How little he knew, the fool. If I can say that with more good Christian grace. But imagine in heaven, you know, as Jesus said about the rich farmer, oh, you fool, this night your soul is required of you. Caiaphas, you fool, you don't know what you've just said. Secondly, I see in this story the futility, the utter nonsense of opposing Jesus like this. You see, after AD 70, history has forgotten the Sadducees. They became extinct. The Pharisees carried on and have carried on down into modern Judaism today, although they're called by a different name. But by the way, also in the Old Testament, and if you've ever noticed, there's no reference to a synagogue. That's not Old Testament. Synagogues again arose in this between Old and New Testament period, when Judaism, rather than being a religion of animal sacrifice, became a religion of the book, of the Torah, and that's where the synagogues hold their place. Anyway, that's another story. But in AD 70, there had been other people who had stirred things up amongst the Jews, and the Romans had decided, we've had enough. And in AD 70, Jerusalem was besieged, and eventually the temple itself, this magnificent temple built by Herod that had only just been finished, was reduced to rubble. And because the Sadducees were associated with the priestly party, well, without a temple, there's no need for priests. The priests disappear from the scene, as they are still no longer found in Judaism today. And the Sadducees are no more. They finished in AD 70. And their fate is the fate of all who will oppose Jesus. You can't take Jesus on and in the ultimate expect to come out the winner. And the third thing that I saw in the story was just how blinding is the effect of power, position, prejudice, and wealth. The old saying that absolute power corrupts and corrupts absolutely is so true. And I think we are seeing that being played out on the European stage now, of someone so sure of his position of power, he can do anything he wants. No, you can't. No, you can't. We all need, however, to take this on board, not allowing anything in our lives to blind ourselves to the truth, to blind ourselves to what is obvious, whatever the blinkers that can just creep up on us so that we can't see things, can't see the big picture. The Sadducees could only see their position of power by cozying up to the Romans, and for them that's all that mattered, and if Jesus got in the way, we'll get rid of him. Jesus is king.